Sarah Kirkland Snider, Something for the Dark, composed in 2016. Snider was born in Princeton, New Jersey in 1973. She received her BA from Wesleyan University and her MM and Artist Diploma from the Yale School of Music. Snider's musical compositions frequently borrow from indie rock and popular musical idioms, as well as classical chamber music forms and instrumentation. These stylistic choices have prompted critics to label her music as part of the burgeoning indie classical movement, where she has been called, quote, perhaps the most sophisticated, unquote, of voices within this genre. Sarah Kirkland Snider writes, quote, Something for the Dark takes its title from a poem by Philip Levine, the Detroit-based and raised Pulitzer Prize-winning former U.S. poet laureate, who was best known for his poems about the city's working class. Something for the Dark is a meditation on renewal and the hard-won wisdom that attends the small, personal, daily triumphs of asserting one's right to be, unquote. Something for the Dark can be heard at Sarah Kirkland Snider's website at sarahkirklandsnider.com. Sergei Prokofiev, Violin Concerto No. 2 in G minor, Opus 63, composed in 1935. When Sergei Prokofiev, 1891 to 1953, graduated from the St. Petersburg Conservatory in 1914, first in his class, he was already well on his way to fame as both a pianist and as a composer. He built his career against the backdrop of World War I. As the only son of a widow, Prokofiev was not called up into the military, a mercy for which we must be grateful, as Russia suffered nearly 4 million military deaths during the war, equal to the combined military deaths suffered by France, Great Britain, and Belgium. Violent frustration over the Russian war effort led Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate his throne on March 2, 1917. An armed insurrection brought Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik Party to power in November of 1917, and the Russian Civil War began. The Civil War would last for 5 horrific years, during which an additional 9 million Russians perished, and the Russian economy was destroyed. Prokofiev did his level best to ignore the events around him, but events did not ignore him, and there was no way he could ply his musical trades in such an environment. So he decided to take a brief trip abroad. He later wrote, quote, On May 7th, 1918, I started my journey, which was to take me abroad for only a few months, or so I thought, unquote. His first stop was New York, which was his home base until 1923, when he decamped Paris, which remained his home base until 1936. Despite his many successes in the West, he felt rootless and unappreciated, which is why in 1936, he made the biggest mistake of his life. After 18 years, he returned to what was now the Soviet Union and became a Soviet citizen. We can only shake our heads. Did Prokofiev not read the papers? Was he entirely unaware of the collectivization and forced starvations that had just killed millions of Soviet citizens? Of the show trials and red terror that corresponded precisely with his return? Did he not understand that the Stalinist state had zero tolerance for individuals that called attention to themselves? Prokofiev was aware of all of this, but he believed that none of it had anything to do with him. He was, of course, very wrong. The Soviet composer Dmitri Shostakovich understood Prokofiev's true position with painful clarity. To quote Shostakovich, "Prokofiev landed like a chicken in soup. He came to Moscow to teach them, and they started teaching him," unquote. And teach Prokofiev they did. He died a broken man on March 5th, 1953, the same day as did Stalin. Prokofiev's Violin Concerto No. 2 was the last piece he composed before his move to the Soviet Union, which is apparent in the music. That's because, in recognition of Soviet socialist realism, which demanded that music be accessible to the proletariat and contain folk-like melodic material, Prokofiev toned down his modernisms in the concerto and presented in their place a style that has been referred to as his new simplicity. For example, the lyric solo violin melody that begins the first movement has the sound and feel of a melancholy Russian village violinist pouring out his soul. For all its virtuosity, the violin material in the first movement never loses its dark-earthed Russianness. Here's how the concerto begins. Claude Debussy, Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, completed in 1894. We consider the French language, at the heart of which is its long, leisurely diphthongs, its combinations of consecutive vowels, and its softly articulated consonants. The fluidity and blurred edges of the French language give it a subtlety, a color, a nuance that have become intrinsic to French culture in general. Just as so-called French Impressionist art celebrated subtlety of color, blurred edges, open composition, shifting light, and a sense of visual fluidity, Claude Debussy's quintessentially French music is the French language in musical action. For Debussy, the nuance and quality of sound, for its own sake, was as important a musical element as melody, harmony, and rhythm. He cultivated a music of long diphthongs, blurred edges, and amazing fluidity, in which ideas ebb and flow without the sort of hard-edged articulation characteristic of German music. Composed in between 1892 and 1894, Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun is not just Debussy's first masterwork, but is considered by consensus to be musical modernism's ground zero, that single work that can be considered the beginning of 20th century musical modernism. The piece is filled with all sorts of innovative compositional techniques, but mostly, though, Debussy's Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun is the French language in musical action. Melodic ideas and phrases are long, lush, and gently articulated. Harmonies are likewise lush and long sustained, and rather than move in a directional progression, they become objects of beauty unto themselves. Music in which shimmering instrumental color and nuance are as important as melody, rhythm, and harmony. Here's how the piece begins. Maurice Ravel, Daphnis et Chloé, 1912, Suite Number 2. Maurice Joseph Ravel, 1875 to 1937, was born in southwestern France in the Basque region of the French Pyrenees, just a few miles from the Spanish border. His mother Marie was a native Basque, and his father, Pierre Joseph Ravel, was a Swiss-born engineer. Ravel would very likely have been a brilliant engineer. He was meticulous in every aspect of his life, from the design of his house to the clothes he wore and the food he cooked. Speaking to both Ravel's workmanship and his father's Swiss origins, Igor Stravinsky referred to Ravel as a Swiss watchmaker. What this means in practical terms is that as a composer, Ravel could not be rushed. This turned out to be a problem, an almost fatal problem, in the composition of the largest orchestral work he ever wrote, what Ravel called a choreographic symphony in 3 parts, Daphnis et Chloé. The piece was commissioned in 1909 by Serge Diaghilev, the founder of the Ballet Russe, for the ballet's 1910 season. Well, that 1910 season came and went without Daphnis et Chloé. The watchmaker needed more time. The 1911 season came and went without Daphnis et Chloé as well. When the score was finally finished on April 5th, 1912, just weeks before the start of the 1912 season, Diaghilev had had enough. Furious over the delays and unhappy with the choreography, he threatened to pull the plug on the whole shebang. But cooler heads prevailed, and Daphnis et Chloé finally came to life on June 8th, 1912. Ravel prepared 2 concert suites from the ballet, the second being the most commonly performed. The second suite is cast in 3 large parts: daybreak, pantomime, and danse générale. The suite begins after Chloé's rescue, with her awakening at daybreak in Pan's grotto. The couple then dances a gentle pantomime of thanksgiving in honor of Pan. The suite concludes with the danse générale. Here are the last moments.